Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Courtauld and to the Centre for American Art. In a moment, I'll introduce Dr. Layla Bermeo, this evening's speaker. But before I do so, a very rapid word about the structure and timing of the event. The lecture will last about 45 minutes, after which we will have a Q&A. And I'll keep the Q&A to around 10 minutes. Apologies in advance to anybody who doesn't get to ask their question as a result of that. When it comes to that point in the proceedings, if you've got a question, please indicate you've got one by typing Q in the chat or using the raise hand icon, or just type the question and they will let you in sequence. There are over 300 people, I think, in the audience, so that is a very good sign. Thank you. I'm delighted now to introduce our speaker, who is Dr. Layla Bermeo, the Kristin and Roger Servison Associate Curator of Paintings in the Art of the Americas Department at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Before joining the MFA in 2016, Layla co-curated the Black History, Art History Performance Arts series at Harvard, held curatorial fellowships at the Williams College Museum of Art and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and served as a guest curator at the African American Museum in Philadelphia. She received her PhD from Harvard. At the MFA, Layla has co-organized Collecting Stories, Native American Art, curated Frida, Kahlo and Arte Popular, and mentored a team of youth curators who developed the exhibition Black Histories, Black Futures. Her topic tonight is Light, Land and Water, Native and Non-Native Visions of New England. I'm now going to hand over to Layla to share the screen.
Thank you so much, David, for that generous introduction and for the invitation. I've so long been an admirer of the work done at the Courtauld Center for American Art, and it's really my honor to participate in one of your programs. So I'm just going to share my screen. I was hoping, really dreaming of being there with you in London today. But it really remains critical for all of us to continue to stay home to help stop the spread of coronavirus. And so I'm speaking to you from my living room in Waltham, Massachusetts. Like the nearby city of Boston, Waltham is located on the homelands of the Massachusetts people who have called this region home since time immemorial. We can all learn more about the Massachusetts people by visiting their newly updated website, massachusettstribe.org, which includes a donate tab there on the right to support the community that continues to be the stewards of this land. So we'll begin our discussion by looking closely at Owl's Head, Penobscot Bay, Maine, an 1862 painting of a New England seascape by Fitz Lane, an artist from Gloucester, the coastal village north of Boston. Over a low horizon line, the sky swells with pink and peach tones, suggesting a tranquil moment near the end of the day when the sun is setting. The fading evening light seems to reflect off of the glassy surface of the bay and then form short, sharp highlights on the ripples of water that approach the rocky shore. On the left, a lone figure stands with his back turned, holding a pole, perhaps gazing at the tree-lined peninsula near the center of the composition, from which Owl's Head gets its name. Or maybe he stands still, watching the ships that seem to drift away from his and our view, shrinking into the background. Lane completed this painting late in his career, during the tumultuous years of the American Civil War, and in doing so, he drew from a long history of European and American harbor views. The conventions of the low horizon, dramatic skies, curving shoreline, and ships in the background were highly visible in the work of British artists at the time, including those who came to the US, such as William James Bennett and Robert Salmon. And we can perhaps see some of those influences in this 1836 lithograph that Lane created while working at William Pendleton's print shop in Boston. But what about the landscape itself as an influence? As art historians, we are good at tracing lineages between people and schools, but how can we describe influences that are non-human? When I look at Owl's Head and see how carefully Lane captured that warm evening light, I think about how that same light must have inspired artists for generations before he got there. The people indigenous to the land depicted here, the Wabanaki people, actually call themselves the people of the dawn. So the distinctive quality of light has always been integral to their identity and origin stories, and by extension to the works of art that they make. The entry for Owl's Head in the Fitz Henry Lane Catalog Raisonné, which is a remarkable and fully open access resource. I could probably give an entirely different talk on how great this online catalog raisonné is. Here, it even mentions the Wabanaki presence in the nearby Camden Hills, represented in the background of the painting. But to my knowledge, no attempts to bring Wabanaki art in conversation with Anglo-American style paintings like Owl's Head has ever been made. There's no doubt that these two objects look very different, but they were both made during the first half of the 19th century and in the same place. I would actually argue that they are both about the same place. And they likely participated in an art market for the same type of collector. Is it possible to explore these connections and to honor the individual artistic traditions of these objects without just making oversimplifying comparisons? Particularly in museum work, where we must constantly confront the issues of size, condition, whether objects need cases, if they need to be rotated, if they're even available. Who tells the stories, and how will we tell them to audiences? This is a challenging question, and one that I will return to. I would first like to share some aspects of how we arrived at this question. So I'll begin with an overview of how Fitz Henry Lane has been presented in our galleries at the Museum of Fine Arts, or MFA, and then try to describe new ways of thinking about landscape art in 19th century New England, considering not just pictures of the land, but also works of Indigenous art that actually embody the land through processes of making. And finally, I'll offer some strategies for how we might connect these Native and non-Native art histories. This work is part of a brand new proposal that I am developing to bring Indigenous art into our galleries of 19th century art in the Art of the Americas wing at the MFA. And so I very much look forward to hearing your feedback during the Q&A. So I'd like to start by giving you a sense of how we have displayed works by Fitz Henry Lane and other landscape paintings of New England from about the mid-19th century, and the stories that we have told in the past leading up to this new proposal. Owl's Head was one of 232 American paintings to enter the MFA around 1945, championed by the collector Maxim Keralic. Keralic referred to the history of American painting between the years of about 1815 and 1865 as the, quote, barren period, between artists like John Singleton Copley and Winslow Homer, who had been well represented in the MFA's collection. He celebrated painters like Fitz Henry Lane, Martin Johnson Heade, Thomas Cole, and John Frederick Kensett, painters who had fallen into obscurity or at least out of the interest for most collectors by the late 19th century. He reveled in rejecting famous names, boasting, quote, "We discarded the motto of the fashionable connoisseur, tell me who the painter is and I will tell you whether the painting is good. Our motto was, tell me whether the painting is good and I will not care who the painter is," end quote. Carol Troyan has described how Keralic delighted not only in the discovery, but in the declaration of who and what represented quintessential American art. We see him here photographed with a mid-19th century weather vane in the shape of a peacock, the type of object associated with rural life that was patriotically romanticized in the United States following World War I, and redefined by collectors like Keralic as folk art. As a Russian Jewish immigrant and little-known singer who married Martha Codman, a woman twice his age from Boston's most elite families, Keralic was an outsider who sought to prove not only his knowledge of America, but his place within it. He would have enormous influence determining what were the purest American objects of the 19th century, claims that would bolster comparisons to and construct a lineage for 20th century American modernism. The story of Maxim Keralic is one of the most significant in the history of canon formation of American art within museums, and particularly important to the MFA's own history. I'm always struck by how remarkable and also unsettling it is that one person could have so much influence on what we see in museums and inherit as art history. Martin Johnson Heade, the Pennsylvania-born artist who painted along the coast of the eastern seaboard, became Keralic's favorite painter, and that is why we have dozens of works of him at the MFA. Although much of his career took place slightly later, like Fitz Henry Lane, Heade also painted waves rippling at the edges of New England shores, skies shifting at different times of the day, and boats on the water. Since the Art of the Americas wing opened in 2010, we've had a gallery dedicated to creating a conversation between these two painters. And even though it has also included works by other artists, including objects of silver and furniture, we still refer to it as the Heade Lane Gallery. This association is rooted in real formal comparisons, but I think also remains linked to the ways in which these paintings were collected and entered the museum together, meaning that not only the works, but also the presentation remains part of Keralic's legacy. The opportunity to introduce a new narrative to the Heade Lane Gallery came around 2015 when the majority of our paintings by Heade went out on loan. Following the 2007 exhibition at the Cape Ann Museum, Fitz Henry Lane and Mary Blood Mellon, Old Mysteries and New Discoveries, Karen Quinn installed a wall with not one, but 4 different versions of Owl's Head, one by Lane, 2 by Lane's student Mary Mellon, and one that appears to be a collaboration between the two painters. As an aspiring artist who lived in New York and Massachusetts in the 1850s and 60s, Mary Mellon may have encountered Lane through her connection to Gloucester, where her brother was pastor of the Universalist Church. As an apprentice, she began copying Lane's paintings, and eventually a newspaper reported that Mellon's copies were so faithful that Lane himself was sometimes uncertain about which were his when both were shown side by side. John Wilmerding has argued that upon inspection this close, it is actually quite possible to see that her reflections on the water are not as nuanced, the rigging on the ships not as crisp, her treatment of light not as poetic. He suggests that as a copyist, Mellon saw but did not really understand or feel what she was painting. But some of these comparisons fail to consider the different stages of their careers, when Mellon was at the beginning of her career versus when Lane was a mature painter, or the fact that Mellon probably would not have had access to the experiences working as a lithographer or becoming part of the Boston art scene that Lane had beginning in the 1840s. The focus on their collaborations, canvases which are either signed by both artists or unsigned and difficult to determine the hand or hands, opens a way to think about how Lane and Mellon may have influenced each other as they revisited his earlier subject matter together. This installation also introduced interesting questions about the place of copies in the study of American painting and in museums. Although copying is a very old and common academic method of learning to paint, the insistence on the uniqueness of a painting compared to works of art in other media remains largely intact. I find it interesting that Lane seems to have admired Mellon's copies of his paintings, reportedly keeping her version of 2 ships in rough water on his easel until his death. It seems he was really unconcerned with how her work might destabilize the originality of his own. The reorganized Lane Mellon Gallery at the MFA also included a section on conservation, showing the different imaging techniques that our conservators used to study the 4 Owl's Head paintings. It encouraged visitors to see the paintings in layers as handmade objects, some with underdrawings and differing thicknesses of paint. A related section described Lane's use of the Camera Lucida, an optical device consisting of a mounted prism that reflects the object in front of it, enabling the observer to see and trace the object's ghost. Examinations of finished paintings, like Coffin's Beach on the left there, show how Lane used the Camera Lucida in combination with freehand sketching to capture the topography of this shore near Gloucester and create the underdrawing. These displays reflected some of the most recent research on Lane, an approach combining the fields of art history and conservation to tell a new story about how a familiar painter actually made his work. The introduction of Mary Mellon, however, a lone woman in our galleries of landscape painting, is what continues to linger with me. When her pictures were returned to the private collectors that own them, we once again resumed our all-male presentation of American landscape. I've been thinking more and more about the lack of women represented in studies on historical American landscape because we currently have an exhibition at the MFA that focuses fully on women artists. Women Take the Floor, which is organized by my colleague Noni Gadsden. Creating projects that include only women artists, like creating projects that include only artists of color, is controversial and not without reason. Such attempts to celebrate overlooked artists and address systematic exclusions in the art world can be a form of segregation and even threaten to simply reestablish white male artists as the neutral, if not the standard. But as an institution, this project also gave us an important opportunity to examine our own spotty history of collecting and displaying modern women artists, a moment of reckoning that promises to shape how we represent 20th century art moving forward. Women Take the Floor includes a landscape gallery, brilliantly titled No Man's Land, which presents familiar artists like Georgia O'Keeffe alongside less well-known painters like Doris Lindo Lewis and Lucita Hurtado, who collapse representations of the land with those of women's bodies, making explicit references to female forms that had perhaps always been implicit in traditions of landscape painting. This gallery, filled with landscapes made by women in the 20th century, now just reminds me of how absent they are in our stories about the 19th century. How to address this absence? Mary Mellon is a rare example of a woman who created and signed her canvases, and even then she remains relegated as simply a copyist. Rather than resigning ourselves to the idea that women just had no role in conceptualizing and establishing representations of the American landscape, I wonder if the tight association with landscape and painting is the larger issue. If we broadened our definition of landscape to include more media that women had access to in the 19th century, such as watercolor, needlework, painted furniture, and fabrics, we would also broaden our definition of who is a landscape artist. When I arrived at the MFA in 2016 as the new assistant curator of paintings, the Mary Mellon display was coming to its closing date, and I was charged with reinstalling the gallery. I was not very familiar with Fitzhenry Lane at the time, and I think particularly because I'm originally from the landlocked middle of the US, I didn't have the personal connections that many local people have to these New England port cities and beaches. Reading much of the scholarship on Lane and on our past interpretations of his work, I was struck by this local focus on the artist, the sites of his paintings, and also on our own story of how Maxim Keralic had bought most of the paintings and given them to the MFA in the 1940s. This oft-repeated story of 20th century rediscovery made me wonder about who had bought these paintings in the 1840s when Lane was still alive. Who were his original patrons, and might they offer a way to open some international dimensions in Lane's works? After all, he painted not just local harbors, but ships that would have been associated with world travel and trade. Globally interconnected narratives are particularly encouraged within the department in which I work, which is not a department of American art, but notably an Art of the Americas department, a context that gives us the responsibility to collect, present, and interpret art not just from the United States, but from across Latin America and Canada, including the Caribbean and indigenous nations. So how to turn such a local story into a global one? It turned out to not be very hard, because once I began learning about Lane's original supporters, I found out that they mostly fell into two groups. People who were part of the charmingly titled Codfish Aristocracy, or those involved in the China trade. The Codfish Aristocracy refers to merchants based in Gloucester who built their wealth selling salted cod in the Caribbean, where it was sold to feed enslaved workers. Sharon Worley has shown that many of the descendants of these merchants gave their paintings by Fitzhenry Lane to the Cape Ann Museum, such as Gloucester Harbor from 1852, donated by the family of Sidney Mason, who also owned a major plantation in Puerto Rico. It doesn't seem that the Lane paintings now in the collection of the MFA are connected to the Codfish Aristocracy. Instead, many of the original collectors made their money in the China trade. So the same people who bought Lane's paintings of harbors in Boston and Salem also bought pictures of the harbors of Guangzhou, which was then called Canton by Europeans and Americans, and Macau, like this one, which is, these paintings are by Chinese artists whose names are no longer known. And I apologize for the bad photograph here. This is the work on the left, and then on the right, we're seeing an image of it on the wall. In addition to harbor views and other works of Chinese export art from the mid-19th century, this gallery also included a portrait of Wu Bingjian, also known as Hao Hua. Why? What does he have to do with Fitzhenry Lane? Histories of the China trade fill studies on the building of wealth and the formation of art collections in the United States, especially here in Boston. But they tend to be very one-sided. People named Forbes, Perkins, and Cushing brought back tea, silk, and porcelain. But who in China was trading with them, and what were they receiving? In the decades after independence, when Americans were no longer required to trade with China through England, Hao Hua was one of very few Chinese merchants authorized to conduct business with them. He funded their investments, he paid off their fines, including those incurred for selling opium, which was one of the few products that Americans could offer that was desired by the Chinese. And he granted access to desirable exports. Haokwa also understood the significance of portraiture to his Western business partners. He commissioned painters to capture his sharp chin, deep-set eyes, and silk clothing in oil on canvas, a medium rarely used in Chinese art. His likeness solidified these relationships, hanging in the homes of New England merchants, including those who commissioned Lane to create portraits of their vessels. So, for example, in the collection of a major China trader named Robert Bennett Forbes, that collection includes a similar portrait of Haokwa, as well as ship portraits by both Lane and by Chinese artists that would have been made in ports in China. Portraits of Haokwa became such status symbols here in the US that both Chinese and American artists continued to copy and sell them after he died in 1843 as one of the richest men in the world. There's actually a chance, I think, that this version, our Haokwa, might be a posthumous copy, despite the fact that the family records claim a close personal friendship between their ancestor and Haokwa. Moving on to questioning definitions of American landscape. Now that I've tried to describe the kinds of issues that we've attempted to draw out in our presentations of mid-19th century landscape so far, including those related to women artists and global narratives, I'd like to spend the next few minutes thinking through definitions of American landscape art and how they might be expanded to include works by Indigenous artists. The majority of the works that I've referenced today would be more accurately described as seascapes rather than landscapes, or sometimes referred to as marine paintings. Although scholars in our field have carefully explored representations of the ocean, considering its elusiveness to representation, resistance to geopolitical boundaries, and great scientific unknowns, images of sea and waterscapes remain a subcategory within landscape, and many artists who paint them also paint what we would more readily describe as pictures of land. I point to the seascape aspect as one of the many ways paintings by Fitz Henry Lane and Martin Johnson Heade already sit somewhat uncomfortably within studies of American landscape, which perhaps suggests that these very works offer a particularly productive place from which to expand these definitions. After Maxim Keralic collected works by Lane and Heade in the 1940s, in the following decades, scholars worked to situate them within the canon of American art history. It was clear that they were different from the iconic works of the so-called Hudson River School, not aspiring to overwhelm viewers with scale or scientific detail of something like Frederick Church's Heart of the Andes, and less overtly concerned with celebrating colonization than works like Asher B. Duran's Progress, The Advance of Civilization. As J. Gray Sweeney has demonstrated, the term Luminism was coined in the 1950s by John Bauer, then curator of American art at the Brooklyn Museum, who collaborated with Keralic. And it was expanded by Barbara Novak in the 1960s and 70s before becoming the subject of a major exhibition at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. in 1980. But the actual definition of luminism remained amorphous the entire time, loosely stressing horizontal compositions, simplified or primitive imagery, and radiant, usually cool but not always, representations of light. The ties to nationalism remain strong, save for some comparisons to British and German painters made by Ted Stebbins, as did the connections to transcendentalist philosophies, which some scholars saw in the still spare compositions of works by Lane and Heade. These ideas seem less applicable, though, to Lane's pictures of bustling steamships or Heade's depictions of Latin American flowers and hummingbirds, aggressively pressed up against the foreground. The challenge of evenly applying luminism to artists' oeuvres is part of what led to the criticism and eventual rejection of the term, although it is important to note that it is still in use. In her study of Heade's hummingbird pictures, Maggie Chow concludes her essay with an analysis of his strange and hilarious gremlin in the studio. Two sawhorses made of logs prop up one of Heade's own paintings of a marsh. Between the sawhorses, a smiling stick figure gremlin glances up at the painting mischievously, and next to him, the water represented in the painting comes to life, spilling from the edge of the canvas and forming a puddle on the floor. Chow writes, quote, "The painting playfully juxtaposes landscape status as a surrogate for real space, signaled by the conceit of painted water turning truly fluid, with its condition as highly fictitious construct. The picture's absurd lower edge, questions rather than celebrates painting as an illusionistic practice, end quote. Here, Heade self-consciously shows how a picture of landscape really has very little to do with the actual land. Instead, it is a flat surface filled with linear perspective, orthogonal lines, blended colors, visual tricks, now revealed by an even trickier gremlin. For me, Gremlin in the Studio, by satirizing the conventions of landscape painting, raises questions about the limitations of depicting the natural world and opens consideration for other artistic methods of representing the land. If not through pictures, how else did artists from this period engage with the landscapes around them? Returning once again to Fitzhenry Lane's Owl's Head to focus this question, I've always been interested in the inclusion of Penobscot Bay in its full title. This inlet in south central Maine is named for the Penobscot people who have lived in the area for over 10,000 years. So what kind of art were Penobscot people making in the early 1860s when Lane was visiting their homelands? And how might these objects offer a different way to think about art and land? Like Owl's Head, this basket was made in the 1860s in the Dawnland, the Wabanaki land, making up most of the present-day state of Maine and stretching into New Brunswick, mainland Nova Scotia, and other parts of Canada. Wabanaki is the collective name for 4 different indigenous tribes in Maine: the Maliseet, Micmac, and Passamaquoddy, as well as the Penobscot people. This basket is woven from splints harvested from ash trees, a material strong enough to make a sturdy basket for heavy-duty use, yet flexible enough to be woven into highly detailed, intricate, and delicate designs. But ash trees also have spiritual meanings for Penobscot and other Wabanaki people, with connections to their origin stories. In 1884, a writer recorded one of these stories as told by Molly Sepsis, a Passamaquoddy woman. Glusacup came, first of all, into this country, into the land of the Wabanaki, next to the sunrise. There were no Indians here then, and in this way he made men. He took his bow and arrows and shot at trees, the basket trees, the ash. Then Indians came out of the bark of the ash trees, end quote. Hence, ash is not simply a material used for the artistic practice of weaving, but it also demonstrates the tight connections between people, the environment, and their ancestors. The living, breathing trees here are also relatives. A recent study by Penobscot artist and historian Jennifer Neptune, written in collaboration with anthropologist Lisa Newman, describes the evolution of Wabanaki basket making to the present day. Prior to European contact, Wabanaki people made and used baskets mostly for washing corn, sifting, and carrying supplies. As British and French colonization drastically altered their lives and economies throughout the 18th century, Wabanaki basket weavers began making more and more splint baskets like this one to sell to newcomers. Here, the sides of the basket are formed by thin, uniform strips of woven wood between thicker bands or weavers. This variety in techniques and multiple transformations of the material on a single object show the skill of the person who made the basket, rather than adding any sort of strengthening function for use. The alternating colors, cadmium yellow, iron oxide red, Prussian blue, and indigo, are now faded from their original vibrancy, but would have been carefully swabbed onto the exterior surface of the splints only. Like other artists of the period, Wabanaki basket makers procured commercially produced pigments which were labor-saving but costly, and so they used them sparingly. After the mid-19th century, the primary function of their basket making became an economic one, as they adapted skills that were thousands of years old to suit this new market. A Penobscot woman, whose name we no longer know, likely wove this basket using skills passed down within her family for generations. Other members of her community may have been involved with harvesting ash, carefully selecting the best trees based on a set of technical criteria for matching individual trees to basket-making needs, perhaps giving a prayer or offering at the time the tree was cut, and then pounding the log until the growth rings separated and could be split into long strips for weaving. As the demand for baskets grew and they became more financially dependent on selling baskets because of the losses of their land to colonial powers, Wabanaki people combined their traditional knowledge with new technologies, such as wood splitting tools and molds for holding the shape of a basket. And so on the left there, we're seeing a wooden mold, and on the right, an example of how a basket weaver would weave around it. This earlier example of a similar Penobscot basket was likely made without a mold, But the range of colors here, the standards or vertical splints are indigo, and the wider weavers and cover are red, green, and natural. And the delicate decorative handle, these elements all show how quickly and masterfully Penobscot women adapted their weaving practices to incorporate artistic elements for the market. And even as they produce works for those outside of their communities, their baskets remain imbued with the connections to natural resources, historical teachings, and spiritual meanings, as they still are today. The stories of maintaining connections to the land through art, even through market-oriented or souvenir art, also characterize Wabanaki beadwork. Centuries before European contact, Wabanaki people embroidered their clothing with moose hair and porcupine quills, dyed with colors derived from plants. Beginning in the 17th century, traders bought cloth, wool, and glass beads produced in Europe, which Wabanaki people incorporated into their textiles. Even as their materials changed, many of their designs persisted and were handed down to newer generations of embroiderers and beadworkers. This pouch, for example, which is attributed to a Maliseet artist, is made with imported velvet and ribbons, and it is richly embroidered with 3 daisy-shaped blossoms sprouting from a linear stem, flanked by round organic forms and bordered by delicate rows of beads and a diamond-shaped pattern at the top. But even this elaborate design seems to reference earlier motifs, such as the double scrolls, so like right here. These types of double scrolls appear on Wabanaki objects and clothing from decades earlier, even maybe centuries earlier, sometimes representing political alliances, but most often referring to ideas about balance. The symmetry of this beadwork could further emphasize this notion of balance, important to all life forms. This is an example of how Wabanaki philosophies about nature remained highly visible in works of art made for people outside of the community, who would likely not be able to recognize them. In the 1920s, a Wabanaki consultant reportedly shared with the influential anthropologist Frank Speck that the floral beadwork designs created within her community represented, quote, plants which are good as medicines. Other sources have suggested that historical examples of Wabanaki beadwork that specifically include 3-leaf botanical designs, so like we're seeing here in the lower half of the design. This is an 1860s example from the collection of the Maine Historical Society. These referenced plants that were intended for healing. And we can also see that a double scroll is also visible here. People, I believe both native and non-native, kept small pouches like this one close to their bodies, in a pocket or worn as a necklace, sometimes filled with herbs. So the design on the outside of the pouch might also reference the actual plant held inside. The connections between beaded plants and real ones were likely maintained even in more complex examples. In the corners of this beaded pouch, we can also see white 3-leaf designs in the upper corners. Their oblong shapes echoed in the petals of the 3 large blue flowers. In addition to studying and practicing traditional techniques of Wabanaki basketry, Penobscot artist Jennifer Neptune also taught herself beadwork by looking at historical examples like the ones in our collection. She reflects, quote, I see medicine plants in the designs, and it's obvious to me that people were beading designs of plants that were highly valued to themselves, their families, and their tribe. When I look at the floral designs, I see plants that ease childbirth, break fevers, soothe coughs and cold, take away pain, heal cuts, burns, and bruises, and maintain general health. 100 years ago, plants were the main source of medicine for natives as well as non-natives. With the knowledge and importance of these plants in our culture, beadworkers needed to look no further than their own backyards for their floral designs. 100 years later, these same plants are still in our backyards, are still being used for healing, and are still being used to inspire our beadwork designs. End quote. Neptune's emphasis on endurance of these plants, of Wabanaki beading techniques, of practices of healing human bodies through nature is particularly powerful given the violent histories of colonization that they survived, and the many stereotypes about Indigenous people as a vanishing race that continue to shape popular understandings of their cultures and communities. In Neptune's words, we also find an emphasis on the knowledge of the beadworkers. Their ability to identify and use plants for healing is not separate from their practices of stringing beads with the needle, sometimes following a paper pattern of flowers, and embroidering the designs onto fabric. Similarly, weaving baskets requires a deep knowledge of ash trees, how to identify those that would make the best baskets, the best time of the year to harvest the materials, ways to create a reciprocal relationship with the earth rather than just taking from it. Unlike landscape paintings, which show relationships between humans and the land through a picture, works of 19th century indigenous art from New England are not representations of the land. Rather, they remain part of the land from which they came. They embody the land in the very processes and materials required for their making. And so I wonder if it is possible to think of these objects as another form of landscape art, or at least art that is about the land. I wonder if bringing baskets and beadwork into conversation with paintings could not only help us learn more about Indigenous art histories, but like Heade's gremlin in the studio, reveal something about pictures as well, opening up new ways to understand landscape art in the 19th century United States. I'd like to conclude this talk with a few suggestions for how we might explore connections between Native and non-Native artists in 19th century New England, and how we could make these intersecting art histories visible within a museum space. As I've described, many of the works of art that Wabanaki and other Indigenous artists in New England made in this period were already entangled within non-Native communities, as they created many of their objects to sell to white people, British, French, and American settlers, as well as tourists. The presence of Indigenous artists at major tourist sites, the White Mountains in New Hampshire, the resort towns on Mount Desert Island in Maine, and especially Niagara Falls, has been thoroughly studied, in particular by Ruth Phillips, who has written, quote, "The participation of Aboriginal people in the commoditization and touristic systems can be understood as a strategy not only for economic, but also cultural survival." While the fields of art history and anthropology had long ignored the study of objects sold at tourist sites, such as this quill pouch that is modeled after fashionable Euro-American handbags, Phillips describes how they evidence the preservation of traditional techniques within new forms and the participation of Indigenous people in modern life and economic systems. Less work has been done, though, examining how landscape painters of the period, not just Fitz Lane, but also Thomas Cole, Frederick Church, and Albert Bierstadt, also worked at these same sites. A similar sense of nostalgia and reaction against industrialization that inspired tourists to buy handmade Indigenous objects, like this one, perceived to represent a simpler time, also guided the editing out of crowds and guardrails in landscape paintings. Just as an examination of Fitz Lane's patrons opened a new narrative about the China trade, it seems likely that some of the collectors of landscape paintings would have also been filling their homes with quillwork, baskets, and beadwork. In addition to examining histories of collecting, we might look for overlaps between the materials or themes of these different objects. I'm struck, for example, by the fact that in addition to ash, sweetgrass is the other material critical to Indigenous practices of basket making, and it grows near marshes, the same type of marshes that Martin Johnson Heade revisited and painted throughout his career. Scholars have discussed Heade's interest in the shifting light at different times of the day, perhaps not unlike Monet's paintings of haystacks, and how he might have shared the widespread fascination with weather and meteorology at the time. These 19th century ideas about science could offer interesting connections to Indigenous ways of knowing. As Potawatomi scientist Robin Wall Kimmerer so beautifully describes in her book Braiding Sweetgrass, sweetgrass can have a symbiotic relationship with humans, who can plant its roots directly in the ground so that it passes from hand to earth to hand across years and generations. After seeing farmers harvest salt hay, a different variety of marsh grass represented in the triangular molds and piled on a wagon, Heade remarked, quote, "Salting hay as a historical agricultural process is one in which man has successfully reaped without damaging the natural balance of the marsh ecology." Here, the notion of balance emerges in both native and non-native ideas about the land and related works of art. Even if landscape painters like Heade believed that they were picturing the United States, they were always on native land, seeing skies, coastlines, and bodies of water that other artists had viewed and drawn inspiration from for thousands of years earlier. And so regardless of whether or not they were conscious of it, their paintings of these places may have Indigenous concepts embedded within them, simply because they worked in the same setting in which Indigenous people first conceived these ideas about the natural world. In Heade's 1862 painting Dawn, for example, a sailboat drifts across calm waters as waves lap at the shore. The shape of a rocky bluff on the left mirrors the soft clouds in the background on the right, where purple and orange tones seem to glow, anticipating the coming drama of the sun. When I showed this image to Roger Paul, a Passamaquoddy and Maliseet linguist, he told me that the word for dawn in their language referred specifically to the moment when you are able to see the morning light, but not yet the sun. Exactly what is shown here in Heade's painting. Roger said that if there could ever be a painting that represented his homelands, the Dawnland, this would be it. His engagement with this painting begins to offer, I think, a new approach to opening up the stories that these pictures can tell. In most studies of American landscape painting, histories of Native peoples only enter the discussion when Native figures are explicitly pictured. So here I'm thinking about the tiny figures on horseback at the bottom of Albert Bierstadt's panoramic views, or the miniature feather-clad characters from The Last of the Mohicans in the series by Thomas Cole. A problem with this method is not only that such representations of Indigenous peoples are always filtered through white stereotypes of the period, but also that it fails to acknowledge that the land itself is inherently a Native subject and issue. There is no neutral way to represent an American landscape. No moment, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, when every part of this country was not bound to histories of contested homelands, broken treaties, forced migrations, or the creation of the reservation system. Bringing forward these histories, particularly using Indigenous frameworks and collaborating with Indigenous thinkers, can make these paintings have more in common with works of Native art that maybe they seem to not have those connections at first glance, and perhaps also offer ways that we might begin to bring them together in a gallery space. Comparisons between landscape paintings and works of Native art are often attempted in museums, but I would say rarely successful. We are often confronted with a piece of beadwork by an unknown Indigenous artist positioned next to a sweeping panoramic painting by a famous white male painter. And rarely do we have the opportunity to learn about the beadwork on its own terms within the community that it came from. As I think about bringing Native art made in the 19th century New England into our gallery of work by Martin Johnson Heade and Fitzhenry Lane, I am determined to try to avoid comparisons that would oversimplify the works by both the Native and the non-Native artists. And I'm presently trying to think through other methods of display and interpretation. Fortunately, new models for displaying Indigenous art in museums have emerged over the last few years, which have the power to influence displays of works by non-Native artists as well. One of the most exciting models emerged within the exhibition Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists, which opened at the Minneapolis Museum of Art in Minnesota in 2019. I had the opportunity to speak to the co-curator, Jill Abergyohi, who organized the show with Terry Greaves, a Kiowa beadwork artist and expert. Over the course of 5 years, Yohi and Greaves convened both international and local advisory boards of Indigenous artists, scholars, and community members who shaped the exhibition. They contributed to the selection of the objects, helped write and translate the labels, and design the experience, which acknowledged the trauma that Indigenous people can feel when entering museums. In addition to deeply admiring this sensitive, collaborative method, I was particularly struck by the way that they began their work on the exhibition by reaching out to their many advisors and asking them to respond to the question, why do Native women make art? The answers that they received fell into 3 broad categories: legacy, relationships, and power. And these were the categories that they used to structure the show. A simple question, one that might seem to have no real answer, but also endless answers, opened the door to new ways of doing research, creating scholarship, and presenting works of art to the public. I titled my talk today Light, Land, and Water because I'm thinking similarly about questions that I might ask Indigenous experts, as well as scholars on Lane and Heade, about how these 3 elements of the natural world appear or shape landscape paintings, as well as baskets, beadwork, and quillwork. I'm hoping that an open question like this will refresh our vision on works of art that have been in our collection for a very long time, and help us see connections between objects and histories that previously seemed to be in isolation, even if they occupied the same time and space. When the Art of the Americas wing first opened in 2010, Heade and Lane were part of the story of 19th century art, situated in their gallery on the 2nd floor. All of the works by Indigenous artists, however, were displayed in one gallery on the lower level, forming relationships with each other, but segregated from the rest of the history of American art. This gallery represents where scholarship was back around the year 2000, when my predecessors first started planning the Native North American Gallery. At the time, it was revolutionary to include a gallery and collection of Indigenous art within a department and building dedicated to American art. And in many ways, it still is. We don't see these sorts of collections together in the majority of museums. And the idea was to show that Native artists were here first, that they were, quote, foundational to all of the art that followed. This latter idea, the description of foundational, has aged poorly, in particular because nobody buys that argument if you can't show how Native artists interacted with or influenced non-Native people. And while strong arguments for having a space dedicated to Indigenous artists remain, the current gallery is not guided by Indigenous concepts or worldviews, but by geographies and categories reflective of white collecting practices. Moving away from these methods of display requires, I would argue, not only rethinking how we present Indigenous art, but also how we present works by white artists. Rather than continuing to frame our approaches to landscape through inflexible conventions of landscape painting, raising questions about the role of light, land, and water, equally important to Native and to non-Native artists, could perhaps offer the basic elements in which to build new histories of old New England. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Layla. Thank you very much. Because of the peculiarities of doing this online, you know, I'm sure you have a large and geographically widely distributed audience, and I'm sure that I speak for them when I say they're probably clapping just at the moment. But there's no way of getting that information to you directly. You just have to have it mediated through me. But that was fantastic. Thanks so much. I mean, it's really fascinating to hear you talk about bringing together these intersecting art histories, as you put it, and different work categories of work, type of work, all of which have been isolated mm-hmm. and not brought together. And then to begin to think so interestingly about the ways in which it might be possible to do the work of bringing them together and do that in the gallery as well. So thank you. There's a huge number of questions and they're just popping up the whole time. Some of them are just saying, fantastic, that was a great talk, and being just very positive about what you've said. Others tend to focus on around, actually, I'm looking at about 20 or 30 questions, I think. Maybe you can see them too, can you?
I think so. I think the earlier ones are sort of toward the top. I'm happy to try to answer anything if you want to choose one, David.
Well, they seem to focus around this question that you were really getting your teeth into and exploring towards the end of the paper particularly, which is the question of how you make that comparison work, and if it is a comparison, or how you make that bringing together work. Both because of some of the things you said, the difficulty of actually doing that when there is very little to bring to concrete evidence of sort of mutual awareness even. Maybe I can sort of distill a question that might be about that, about mutual influence, mutual awareness, and ask you to perhaps just say something about that.
About the sort of mutual awareness of like these works in the museum, or?
Yeah, I think of, well, perhaps your historical actors, really. I mean, do we have any sense of how, or if people like Heade, or, you know, were actually aware of Native American?
Yeah, that's so that's a question that comes up almost immediately. I think, like, you know, what was their sort of knowledge of either the Native histories of these lands that they are depicting, or of actual Native people and artists that would have been working in the same period. And I think it's safe to say that it was probably pretty slim. I don't think it matters if they knew or not. Like, I don't think it matters if Heade, when he went to Penobscot Bay, actually thought about Penobscot people, because in his work, that is what he's already representing something that is inherently theirs, whether or not he thought of it that way at the time. And so I think, you know, the sort of question is, like, what histories were already attached to these places, and therefore to representations of these places, even if the artists were not fully aware of them. And even if viewers at the time were not fully aware of them, I believe that there is a method of seeing agency just through the places themselves, which are so critical and so much a part of Indigenous life and communities still today, as they would have been in the moment that Heade and Lane were working.
Thanks. Can I ask if Suzanne Matthews is still in the audience, whether you'd like to ask your question? Yep, there you go. I think Suzanne is, you should be audible.
Right. Thank you. I was wondering about the artists from the Wabanaki side, because what you were telling us was they became more present in the shops and to visitors when they displayed their work, and they actually adapted their work according to the market influences. I was wondering, was there any other influence on their work apart from the market demands? Were they influenced by the other painters who came to them, to that land during that time, or were they aware of European art, not only markets, but also new American art? Was there any sort of connection?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for that. You know, I would say that it is important to acknowledge that the influences on these artists begin before European contact as well. So between separate groups, between separate communities, right? So, you know, there's a lot of discussion, for example, in the examples of Wabanaki beadwork, that there were influential exchanges between Wabanaki people and Iroquois people. So other native groups are also sort of making different designs. And there are exchanges of patterns before European contact, which then sort of ramp up, I would say, with the kind of market drive and pressure on all of these communities. In terms of actually, so there are traveler artists also that that encounter different Indigenous groups, and they probably would have also had access to some degree of print images that would have been circulating at the time as well. But for the group of objects that I spoke about today that would have been made specifically for tourist markets, the largest influence really is the sort of economic one and their response to it. But it does not mean that it was the only one. It's just more specifically for this group of objects. Thank you again for that.
I wonder if Maureen Moore is in the audience still, and whether you'd like to ask your question about intersectional use of materials, Maureen.
Hi, thank you for the great presentation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I was just wondering about if there's evidence of intersection in the use of materials. So, for example, were non-native artists specifically adopting, maybe some people could say, like colonizing the paint or the beads or the different types of wood in their art, but in kind of a deliberate, strategic way, and maybe not doing it in an effort at colonizing so much as in homage to Native artists.
So paint, not that I know of. What your question makes me think of, though, are white women who become some of the most important consumers for especially beadwork and quill work. So a lot of the objects that would have been made, especially like smaller objects for the home, the little like sort of handbag that I showed, moccasins that would have been very beautifully and sort of delicately embroidered with either quills or beads. It is really, Victorian women that kind of are the sort of the largest market for that, and their own tastes are sort of shifting the way that these designs happen, right? And then they also begin to make similar designs in their own kinds of embroidery. So maybe not necessarily materials that I know of, although it's entirely possible then that they would have incorporated similar types of beads, for example. But a lot of for the embroideries that would have been made in that period by women, I think there probably was an exchange between non-native and native women in terms of the designs and the sort of look of objects. There are also, there is a really interesting, strong narrative about nuns, Ursuline nuns, who teach Native women how to do some of the quill work. And so, you know, there really is like a very interesting sort of back and forth with designs and patterns, if not with exact materials. I hope that's helpful for your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we've got time for a few more.
Sure.
If that's okay, Layla. Can I ask Nicholas Robbins to ask the question?
Oh, I saw him typing something long and complicated.
Hi, Layla.
Hi, Nick.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for coming.
It's fabulous, and I cannot wait to see these reimagined galleries. I was just wondering, my long and complicated question about the sort of way in which art history of indigenous art has moved away from sequestering kind of market-oriented artworks versus, you know, supposedly pure artworks, and how that might also help us rethink how the reception of artists like Lane and Heade, right, who were very much positioning themselves for a marketplace, right, and that kind of the commercial orientation of their work was kind of suppressed, right, in this kind of 20th century mode of art history, right, which wanted to kind of think about them as sort of transcendental philosophers rather than as people making objects that were meaningful to themselves, but also for marketplaces. So I was just thinking, is there a kind of parallel to these histories, or how might the kinds of advances made in indigenous art history help us do better history of landscape painting in a way, in thinking more carefully about markets, I guess?
I love that question. Thank you. I have been thinking about that as well. I think because of the work of Ruth Phillips and other scholars that has done so much, as you say, to sort of break down that that binary between like souvenir art and like real like art, authentic art. And I think because I was thinking about the ways in which souvenir art had been dismissed for so long as like, oh, that was like just for the market. Those were just made for sale. It's like, well, the paintings were also just made for sale too. Like, and I think especially someone like Lane is a really good example where and I think also I just know more about his patrons. They're sort of easier to trace in some way than he does. But it's very easy to see how much his work was shaped by people who owned ships or by people who went certain places or had vacation homes in other places. And so the systems are really similar. And I'm grateful to you for pointing out that really is exactly sort of what we lose in the Keralic era. And so I think it is actually extremely helpful to think not only about the market, but also kind of the lack of function, like, because that's sort of the other sort of thing, including even from some indigenous people are like, well, those baskets like were not functional. They weren't like the sort of original ones that would have been used to like gather potatoes or whatever. And that to me, it rings as another similarity. It's like, right, pictures are not functional either, right? Yeah. So it's like, I think like somewhere between, that's another good example of an affinity, I think, between these types of objects that is very characteristic, right, just of art markets in the 19th century, that the art market was expansive enough to include both paintings by Heade and baskets by women whose names we don't know anymore, that this was sort of all part of the same market, which means, as you're suggesting, that the artists would have been similarly motivated. And so I think that really is a very rich place to unpack. And thank you so much for suggesting it.
Well, thank you for that.
Just a couple more if you're up for
Sure.
it. Yeah, Can I ask Frederica Schaefer to ask a question? maybe she's no longer in the audience. Yeah, there we go.
I'm trying, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, great. Okay, I wasn't sure if my microphone was working. Okay, thank you. I didn't see it. Yes, I tried to keep it really short, so I think I'm just gonna read it out. Thank you very much for your talk. That was really inspiring. And so my question really regards your curatorial research and practice. You mentioned that you plan to involve experts from really different fields in your research. And I'm also wondering how you are planning to represent their work and their research and their knowledge and these kind of different voices that will come up within the exhibition display.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I love that question. So I think what is important about the process of creating this gallery is that this is not something that I can curate or organize on my own. Like, it absolutely needs to be shaped by Indigenous people and experts in a way that is similar to Hearts of Our People, which was a great inspiration to me. So I think a couple of things. So, organizing a group of artists and experts, I will actually first just begin by saying that something I've learned over the last couple of years, which it's important to know, I'm not a scholar of Native art, but I'm very interested in using Indigenous frameworks to look at art of the Americas. And in learning from Indigenous thinkers and writers, it has occurred to me that just in general, when looking at historical Indigenous art of any kind, we have to have a different research process. And that is because so much of the published work has been dominated by non-Native people, a lot of it growing out of anthropology. And they, even when they have relied tightly on consultants, it is a very different way of doing research that is unlike just doing research on Fitzhenry Lane or Martin Johnson Heade, although I think we can sort of learn things from that as well. So interviewing living artists, for example, who still make beadwork or who create baskets, who have stories that have been passed down through within their families that, hey, white people like decided to not publish, either ignored or didn't, or sometimes they're private, but they tend to have a sort of very different story to tell than a lot of the kind of like published works on this art. And so it's sort of, the approach sort of starts with that, with just sort of knowing that research has to be thought of very differently with this material. And then I think it will be a matter of convening many different sort of perspectives on this and asking Indigenous people to help not only look at works of Indigenous art, which is what lots of museums do, but to look at the non-Native works as well. So as I was describing, the Passamaquoddy elder, Roger Paul, who recently looked at the Heade Dawn painting with me. I think that language will be one way to include their voices. Roger Paul has worked with me on to create our first label in one of our galleries in Wabanaki. I'm working on a multilingual labeling project right now. But I was thinking actually this entire gallery could be bilingual, and instead of being bilingual in like English or Spanish, which we often see in the States, to be English Wabanaki. But I think also there will be opportunities for some of these collaborators to also like actually write text. So write some of the labels, which we have done that before. We've had Native experts write a label, and then there has also been a sort of curatorial label. And I am not, part of where I am in my practice is working out whether this is a situation where multiple labels is better, or if it still just looks like the museum has the authoritative label and then here's somebody else talking. So like, I want to make sure that the authority is sitting with our collaborators, and we'll have to work to find the best ways to do that, whether that means that they are primarily writing the labels or also creating videos and doing programs. But it is really critical that they help us to interpret, again, like not only things that their ancestors made, but pictures of their homelands made by non-Native artists as well. So thank you so much for that question. I'm sorry it was long-winded and confusing answer.
Thank you. Just one more, maybe. And can I, if Emily Warner is still here? Yeah.
Hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Hi, Layla.
Hi. Thank you so much for coming.
That was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I guess my question kind of follows on some of the earlier questions that people were asking about how we begin to put these works together in a gallery. And I thought you had some really well, first of all, I love your sort of desire to do this while also recognizing how difficult it is, because it is really difficult. And I think you pointed out some of the pitfalls that can easily happen, especially when it seems to become just a comparative approach or something like that. Right. I thought you had a number of really sort of interesting and compelling ideas in there, especially when you're talking about seagrass and materials and dawn and light, as sort of things that could connect these works made in very different, not just very different traditions, but that require, as you say, very different historical processes for kind of uncovering them. And this is sort of just a very open-ended question, and I don't know if it will be helpful for you or not, but I was wondering if you could sort of turn the question around a little bit and think about what you want the viewer to take away from a kind of reconfigured gallery here. I mean, I think right now, this kind of gets to the question of what the point of the museum is these days. And I feel like we ask museums to do a lot of things, and it's a question that's very much in flux right now. And at one point you sort of indicated that there could be a way to sort of reground this in questions of the land. And that to me would sort of suggest a particular way of both visual and spatial organization of the gallery, and also maybe in terms of the labels. But then there's also another sort of thread I see going through your talk, which is very much about kind of just emphasizing the presence of Native Americans and Indigenous art practices at the heart of, art more generally, American art more generally. And not that those are necessarily in tension, but I'm just kind of wondering about sort of several different aims I see in your talk. And if you were to think about it from sort of what the viewer might take away, what would that be, and maybe what would that sort of start to look like in terms of influencing your installation practices, or how you would begin to put these objects together?
I think, thank you so much for that, Emily. That was very helpful to sort of hear what kind of was standing out to you. I think that I love this question of like, what, like, there's like all these different things you want to do, but like, what would you like visitors to know? So I think I'm very interested in shaking up our sort of definitions of what constitutes American landscape. I think that does happen in American art later, in like the 70s. So thinking of like Ana Mendieta and like Smithson and things like that. And I'm kind of curious as to whether that can happen in an earlier period if we think about Indigenous artists, right, who are inherently sort of working with the land. And I think that's where a lot of the interest in materials is coming as well. Yeah. So I think that that would sort of be one of the primary functions. I have my responsibility, I think, as an MFA curator is to work to get Indigenous art out of that little gallery in the basement. Yeah. So this is like, which we have been doing that in sort of little bits and pieces, especially because right now we do have a brilliant research associate, Tess Lukey, who's herself Wampanoag and an expert in Native art. And so we've been working on a number of small projects. The 19th century is of great interest to me, not only just in general, but also in terms of the Art of the Americas wing at the MFA, because it is actually the only floor where there is not a single object from Latin America, and there hasn't been, of Indigenous art. So there's like Spanish colonial stuff on the 18th century, and then in the modern floor, we often have works of modern Latin American art. But the 19th century is specifically sort of an area that has been really lacking in the sort of more of the internationalizing kind of America's focus. And I think something that is also important to do is to sort of honor the sovereignty of Indigenous communities by showing that these stories are both local and also international. So like a US Wabanaki story is like a local one, but it's for us here in New England, but it's also international because Wabanaki people are sovereign. So like for me, that is like a sort of an interesting way to sort of use the context of the Art of the Americas to help people learn about local histories in a way that's maybe unexpected. And I think the material sort of sits at the kind of intersection of all of those ideas. So thank you so much again, Emily.
Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Layla. I think I said 10 minutes for the Q&A, and actually we've done 20. So thank you for doing that, because the answers
great, thank you.
were also fascinating. need, before bringing it to a close, to say thank you again to Layla formally.
Thanks
You
for
have
having me.
nearly 500 people in the
Wow,
audience.
that's great.
Which
Thank you so much.
about the importance of the topic, as well as the interest in hearing you speak about it. Thank you. Those of you who indicate that they would like to review some of the material, or look again, or listen again, or see some of the slides again, absolutely understood. And the plan is, Layla's been very generous in agreeing to have the events recorded, and they'll be up through the Courtaulds Research Forum in due course, quite quickly probably. So please do look out for that. And we'll be reviewing the chat as well, be assured of that. I'm very sorry about not getting to everybody, but there were just so many questions bustling to be asked that we just couldn't do it. Anyway, many thanks again. Layla, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here.
Okay, we're going to leave. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.